Good morning and welcome to this STUC and Scottish Hazards organised Scotland-wide International Workers' Memorial Day. My name is Foyer. I'm General Secretary of the Scottish TUC and I'm honoured to be chairing today's event. And if I can just ask you all to use the hashtag on any social media for today's event of hashtag IWMD21. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of activity on social media to mark all of the things that are taking place. Now, this is the second online International Workers' Memorial Day event we've held since the beginning of the COVID crisis. But as many of you will know, this is an annual event for trade unionists and safety campaigners who use this day to remember those who've lost their lives, to show solidarity with those who've suffered illness or disease, to grieve with the families and friends who've lost loved ones, and to redouble our efforts to make workplaces safer through better policy and union organising. And as in previous years, trade union councils and union branches across Scotland are marking this day. Some are holding small socially distanced events, and some are marking the occasion online. Trades councils from Wick to Dumfries and across the country regularly mark this day. Councils and other public bodies will lower flags. 26 of Scotland's 32 local authorities will mark this day. Some public bodies will also light up public buildings in purple as a tribute. And here's some of the buildings which will be purpose lit today across Scotland. Aberdeen Council headquarters, the Scottish Government's headquarters at St Andrew's House in Edinburgh, the Scottish Government building at Victoria Quay in Edinburgh, Perth Bridge, Edinburgh Castle, Bascule Bridge in Renfrewshire, Renfrew Town Hall, Johnston Bandstand, Lerwick Town Hall and Glasgow's SEC Hydro. And at our event today, we'll hear contributions from 5 speakers from across the trade union movement and from the health and safety community. And at 11 AM, before they speak, and after I've concluded this introduction, we will hold a minute's silence as a mark of respect for all those who've lost their lives because of their work. Of course, this year's event is particularly poignant as the COVID crisis continues. The comments attributed to Boris Johnson on Monday of this week, suggesting he would have rather seen the bodies piled high in the streets rather than entertain a further lockdown, speak to a view about human life compared to commerce and profit, which is all too prevalent among the capitalist political classes. And the UK government's reluctance to introduce safety first measures during the first year of this pandemic have been all too obvious. Whether it was eat out to help out, the rush back to school opening, mixed messages about office working, or the reopening of non-essential manufacturing and construction, we saw a government last year that was all too eager to prioritise profit and politics over people. And while we recognise that the Scottish Government's approach to safety throughout this period has been somewhat better, in no small part because they were at least willing to listen to trade unions, nevertheless, we had to fight hard battles, and some of them we didn't win. There is no doubt that immediate economic and political pressures had an increasing influence on policy here too, at the expense of safety. We opposed the early reopening of schools and universities, and during the third lockdown challenged the failure to close non-essential manufacturing and construction. On those issues, we believe we were vindicated. We also believe that when a full inquiry takes place into health and safety in our residential care sector, it will confirm that serious mistakes were made at both national, policy and at local workplace level. Having been subjected to over 150,000 deaths now at UK level and over 10,000 here in Scotland, many that might have been prevented, it has to be acknowledged that our governments have collectively failed us in their primary duty, the duty to protect the lives of their citizens. So once again, for the second International Workers' Memorial Day, held during the pandemic, it's right that we pay special tribute to those who've lost their lives due to workplace COVID infection, as well as the frontline workers who were put at risk undertaking essential work. This includes those who contracted the virus undertaking work that wasn't necessary, and too many workers were denied basic health and safety protections over the past year, and unions fought a day and daily battle to guarantee effective PPE. Because we know that whether through COVID, through preventable accident, or through industrial disease, bad work kills. Bad work shortens people's lives and causes life-affecting illness. So whilst we remember those who've lost their lives through COVID, we also remember work. The international theme for today is health is a human right. To this, the STUC and Scottish Hazards has added, let's make that a reality. In so doing, we recognise that in other parts of the world, human rights and rights at work are weaker than they are here, but here too we need to rebalance the responsibility away from the worker and towards the employer. We're also making clear that whether in Scotland, the UK or around the world, human rights are only as strong as the democratic and collective levers which enforce them. At government level, that means stronger and better resourced health and safety executive. At workplace level, that means union organising and trade union recognition in non-organised workplaces. It means creating an army of trade union, roving health and safety reps, and an expectation from government that employers should give them workplace access. In the depths of the current crisis, we must pay tribute to all the workers who've lost their lives through COVID infection, but also remember that workplace death, injury and disease is a day and daily occurrence. We must use the period ahead to make workplaces safer, to strengthen workers' voice and collective power, and to bring employers and government to account. I'm now going to pause, and when you see a graphic appear on the screen, I'll ask you to observe a minute's silence for all those workers who've lost their lives in Scotland, the UK, and across the world. And I would ask you all once again to use the social media hashtag IWMD21 to show us pictures of all of the actions and activities that are taking place across Scotland by our trades councils. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm now going to introduce our first speaker of today, and that's Andy Watterson. Andy is a professor at Stirling University. He's a lifelong trade union activist and friend to our movement. He's an expert in public health and workplace health and safety. He's played a long and much valued role in promoting worker safety and that work continues. And Andy has a short presentation that he's going to share with us today.
Okay. Thank you very much. It is yet again another sombre day in a sombre year. We've had layered on top of the pandemic across the globe of workplace ill health and injury, the COVID pandemic, which has taken so many workers' lives and damaged the lives of so many others. I don't want to go into great detail on the statistics, but it's also a day where there are opportunities, and as Rozanne said, opportunities for action. And this morning, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, issued a statement about Workers' Memorial Day. And this knocked into a cocked hat the sort of activities that are going on in the UK government, because he recognised the need for workers to organise, how that influenced their health and well-being, and also their health and safety. So there are things that we can do. Next slide, please. So we know globally each year there's a huge toll taken of workers. There's something like 2.5 million, coming up to the 2.5 million mark, deaths from occupational disease and injury. And we're talking about 6,000 deaths every day. We're talking about 340 million occupational injuries, and we're talking about 160 million cases of work-related illness. It's horrific. And perhaps COVID will focus a great deal more attention on the implications of the workplace on people's health. In Scotland, we know there's just under 100,000 work-related ill health cases, and something like 37,000 new cases occurring each year. Horrific. 45,000 occupationally related injuries. And if we look at the enforcement on that generally, not with regard to COVID, there's just under 1,000 enforcement notices, and there's less than 200 prohibition notices issued. And this is a terrible position in terms of the toll that's been taken. We've seen last year 10 workplace fatalities, and we have, for instance, no good figures about occupational diseases, but we know that there were 185 mesothelioma deaths each year. And if it hadn't been for the past work of the STUC, the trade unions, Clydebank Asbestos Group and Clydeside Action, we wouldn't be aware of and it'd be in the better position that we are, but it's a pretty miserable position anyway. We get details on the costs all the time. So the Health and Safety Executive has estimated that in Scotland, there's something like over £1 billion lost each year because of poor workplace health and safety. They don't talk about the pain and suffering costs in that figure. That's not calculated. And regionally and locally, the position is very unclear, but we know where there are hotspots. We know where there are vulnerable populations of workers. Next slide, please. I don't want to dwell on information that's already out there. The Institute of Employment Rights, the TUC, the STUC, has teased out the failure of regulation during the COVID pandemic, which is also an indictment of the general failure on health and safety. But we know the Health and Safety Executive has been badly led for years, and particularly badly led during the pandemic. We know that in the field there are dedicated support and inspectors at work, but that's not reflected in the leadership. We know the Health and Safety Executive's been underfunded and understaffed and underpowered, and that's really been exposed during the pandemic year. At the height of the workplace clusters, which was in January 2021, only 0.1% of the something like 100,000 COVID safety cases that had been reported did the HSE issue an improvement or a prohibition notice. And the figures more recently that have been in the Hazards magazine indicate far less activity in terms of enforcement over COVID than other workplace safety concerns. So it's a tragedy, it's a disaster, and it's been avoidable. Next slide, please. if we look at the figures that have come out from the National Records Scotland, these are the ones where COVID figures on the death certificate. You can see not necessarily all work caused, but I think I would argue all work related and due to factors that relate to wages, conditions, and so on of the most vulnerable. We can see that, in fact, it's taxi drivers, bus drivers, people in hospitality and supermarkets. It's some skilled workers. It's people generally in transport. It's some in administration, and it's certainly those in caring personal services, social care and health work, where the mortality and also, therefore, the morbidity has been higher. So we've got a good idea about the vulnerability of certain occupations to COVID, even if we don't have the fine detail. Next slide, please. And what can we do about this? I mean, are there opportunities? I mean, it seems unfortunate to use the phrase, but if we don't learn the lessons now from COVID, if we don't seize the opportunity that's been brought to us, then we're not going to see any middle and long-term advances in health and safety. And what COVID has, I think, exposed is the fact to most of the public that there's a high price to be paid by neglecting the health and safety of workers. And we can see the connection between what goes on in terms of workplace health and safety and public health. That's not just in hospitals and it's not just in care homes, but it's far wider than that. It is in the service sector, it is in construction and so on. And what we've also seen is the Scottish Government being given the right, if you like to use that word. Certainly it's developed guidance and regulations after input from the STUC that Ros has mentioned, critical input, to draw up COVID-related workplace hazard and risk guidance. So we can't rely on public health to do this. They've had the lead across the UK on COVID, and one has to say that it's failed. We've also been told, well, we don't have the resources to spend on health and safety. I mean, that's clearly been demonstrated to be absolutely nonsensical. We spent billions during the pandemic on failed test and trace schemes, and yet we've only spent a few £1 million on the health and safety executive. That is criminal. Next slide, please. So there are opportunities for taking things forward. The Zero Cancer campaign in the workplace that came out a while ago, I think, has been a good model. And Zero COVID Scotland has seized on that, where what we're after is eradicating, if possible, but probably being able to minimise the impacts of poor health and safety. Society of Occupational Medicine during the COVID crisis said no death was acceptable in the health service and the care sector. We should adopt a similar approach now when we're looking at workplace health and safety problems generally. And that does relate to regulation, inspection, monitoring and testing that we've heard about. Next slide, please. And I think there are two areas that possibly we should seize on now. The Just Transition Commission has just reported, and very peculiarly, there's very little in there about green jobs and health and safety jobs. It doesn't talk about sunsetting hazardous industries, hazardous occupations. It doesn't link up with public health and the environment. It doesn't talk about toxic use reduction, which Scottish Hazards and I think the STUC and others have been pushing, and it completely misses environmental justice and adverse health impacts in the workplace. So there are opportunities here to build into that and get the Scottish Government to take on board those sorts of aims and objectives, and also to use methods like citizen science, getting effective social licenses and meaningful participatory action research. In that Just Transition Commission, we've got no specific reference to worker health and safety and just one to HSE. So there's an opportunity there. Next slide, please. And finally, we've got the Fair Work in Scotland, which has been pushed by the STUC and trade unions. The Scottish Government has partly listened to it. We've seen the convention in December 2020. So there are opportunities there to go much further, and it's about moving away from encouraging and supporting occupational health and safety action to requiring and, where we can, regulating. There are things that the Scottish Government doesn't control, but there are lots of things that it does. And if you look at Scottish Hazards and the STUC programmes on this, they're talking quite rightly about a proper NHS occupational health service. I think we should be looking at devolving occupational health and safety powers to Scotland, as already happened with public health and the environment, so we don't have the problems that we've seen during the COVID crisis and the lack of action. We should certainly adopt the ILO's occupational health and safety as a fundamental workers' right. If Joe Biden can do it, then the UK government can do it, the Scottish government can do it, linked to the things that we've just heard about in terms of roving trade union safety reps and so on. And we can actually pick up and legislate in some areas to get changes. So we should take on board the Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council bill, which would mean we're in a better position to recognise occupational diseases, identify them, and indeed get compensation and recover monies from bad employers who damage workers. So there are things that we can and should be pushing for now, and the Scottish Government should respond to. And on that basis, we should remember the dead and fight for the living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And it's very clear. I think that was a great presentation. It showed us what we can practically do going forward to fight for the living and make that difference as we move forward from today. I'm going to next invite Phyllis Craig to speak. Phyllis is the Director of Action on Asbestos. That's the Scotland-wide charity for those who've contracted asbestos-related disease. And it's a campaigning organisation to prevent ongoing asbestos contamination. Action on Asbestos has supported thousands of workers, including many trade unionists, to attain justice over the decades. So I'd like to invite Phyllis to speak. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the STUC for inviting me here today. A very hard act to follow is Professor Watterson, so I'm only on to give a short talk so that people will always remember those who have died from an asbestos condition. So 25 years ago, I started my employment with Clydeside Action on Asbestos, now known as Action on Asbestos. During that 25 years, thousands of men and women have died from mesothelioma or asbestos-related lung cancer. It's now been 21 years since asbestos was banned in the UK. But our charity continues to see hundreds of newly diagnosed asbestos conditions every year. People seem to be under the mistaken belief that asbestos-related conditions are a thing of the past. Yet in the year prior to lockdown, Action on Asbestos received 750 new cases of people diagnosed with asbestos conditions. People also seem to think that asbestos was only prevalent in traditional industry. But are people aware that there are over 1,600 schools in Scotland alone that contain asbestos? People will continue to die from this preventable condition because asbestos remains in so many of our public buildings. Action on Asbestos is now seeing more cases of school teachers, janitors, and more people who worked in schools. They are now being diagnosed with deadly conditions. More importantly, we are now starting to see former pupils whose only exposure to asbestos was because they attended school. The STUC have quite rightly made their theme for this event health and safety being a human right. Action on Asbestos believe it is a human right to life, or not to be severely disabled, and so not to be exposed to asbestos. this condition is preventable. Action on Asbestos has written to all of the political party leaders to ask them what their commitment is to having asbestos safely removed from schools. And our charity would like to ask for the STUC and all of the unions to support this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise, speaking about that very important issue and the fact that this is still a killer for workers today. I'm now going to move on and ask Pauline Rourke, who is the chair of the Communication Workers Union Scottish region, to speak. Pauline is also a member of the STUC General Council, and I'm very pleased to say she was last week elected as the STUC's Vice President. Pauline is an active organiser and representative in CWU's telecommunications side. She's recently been central to the creation of the STUC supported Call Collective.
Thank you. Thank you, Roz, for the kind words and the introduction, and for also giving me the opportunity to be part of this event, a very important event. And I think International Workers' Memorial Day has always been such an important day in the trade union diary. But as has been said, this year's is especially poignant. And the COVID pandemic, the past 13 months, has resulted in so many workers who have lost their lives throughout all sectors and many industries. Many of these workers have sacrificed their own lives and their own health, frontline workers, to care for others. I'm sure that Gary will touch upon the care sector and the inequality in that sector following myself. But these individuals have left their homes and their families. Many even came out of retirement because they were dedicated and committed to caring for others while they were carrying out a really essential and important role. But I think it's important to remember these individuals, they weren't a number, they weren't a statistic as shown on the daily news reports and in the press. They were mothers and fathers, daughters and sons, granny and granddads. We've all lost people, we've all lost colleagues. And today I think it's absolutely right that we take this time to reflect and remember each and every one who lost their life to COVID, along with all others who have died because of poor working conditions and work-related injury owing to the lack of safe and regulated working practices. But just to focus on being part of the STUC COVID-19 team this past year, and just to make anyone watching aware that we did hold weekly meetings with the Scottish Government ministers and officials. These discussions, the input and the leverage the STUC COVID team secured has been absolutely pivotal in obtaining safeguards in many areas against the backdrop of public health advice. But what we can't lose sight of is not all workers have the protection of trade unions and the vital role our union safety reps play in ensuring employers fulfil their responsibility and their obligation to maintain and improve safety standards in the workplace. The importance of this item was not lost on the COVID team, and it became a priority issue for safeguards to be built into all Scottish Government sectoral guidance documents, identifying the importance of roving reps, or flexible reps as they may be referred to assist and support many non-recognised workplaces. And we found existing, qualified and highly skilled union safety reps stepping up to support wherever necessary and challenging employers wherever it was found to be required. And the role of our union safety reps has never been so prevalent and important. as we now begin to see the easing of the lockdown restrictions and Scottish Government guidance, and what is now being seen as a return to the workplace. But it's absolutely essential that proper and full risk assessments are carried out with robust arrangements in place, monitoring compliance, and with the collective arrangement and agreement between the employer and trade union representatives. And we need this. It is essential if we are to keep the workforce safe. I'm confident union safety reps will ensure all employers are held to account, and it's going to be a learning to deliver a safe and working environment to avoid needless and preventable accidents and incidents. But I also think today is an opportunity for us to recognise and remember the massive impact mental health symptoms and illness has played, not only throughout the pandemic, but in all our daily lives, at home and in the workplace. And I'm personally and extremely sad that in my own union, the CWU, we have lost several members this past year in the Scotland region who have taken their own lives. And that is replicable throughout all industries. But the CWU, along with the STUC and many other affiliates, recognise the importance of providing mental health support, a safe place where workers can find strength and resilience to help tackle their fears and anxieties. And while poor mental health may not be purely workplace driven, we've all seen the impact of performance management, pressure. So we must again turn to trade unions and our own safety reps who are committed to positive health and wellbeing practices, working with the employer, ensuring that the employer's priority mirror our own. And this is a priority item for us all. Comrades, today we come together to remember those workers who have tragically lost their lives, but also to remind ourselves why we must and will continue to fight for the living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And, you know, I think it's particularly important, the points that you made about our health and safety reps across trade unions. And I would just like to add my thanks to all of the reps who give up their own time and put in more than a shift, who've gone above and beyond the call of duty and all reasonable requirements over this past year in fighting day in, day out to protect people's safety and health at work. I'm now going to move on and ask our next speaker, Louise Adamson, to speak. Now, Louise first became involved with Scottish Hazards in 2006. That was a year after her brother Michael died in an electrocution at work. And over the past 15 years, Louise has told her brother Michael's story and used it as a very powerful tool to highlight key issues around people's health and safety at work. And she's worked as a project worker for Scottish Hazards and is now in a trustee role. In 2018, Louise was named as the most influential person in health and safety in the UK by Safety and Health Practitioners magazine. And Louise is also speaking on behalf of Families Against Corporate Killing. Louise, welcome.
Thank you, Rose. I don't think anyone would need convincing that it's fundamentally wrong that a wife should need to write heartbreakingly about her 6th year on the grief roller coaster, missing her beautiful angel husband so much with every passing hour of her life. Or that it's fundamentally wrong that a mum should be marking the 18th year since her 17-year-old son was taken from her. The pain that she feels never healing, instead festering like an open wound. Or that it's fundamentally wrong that a daughter should wish her dad a happy 56th birthday, while lamenting the fact that he'll be forever 37. And I don't think anybody would need convincing that it's fundamentally wrong that a fiancé should go from choosing wedding cars to instead sitting in a funeral cortege. So we FACers, we're therefore at a bit of a loss to understand why we're even having to seek to convince the International Labour Organisation that health and safety should be recognised as a fundamental right at work. Because of course it should. But seek to do so, we will. And that will involve us taking you on a FACing journey, a FACer's experience of a work-related life-ending journey. So just when does such a journey begin? Is it when a loved one leaves home to go to work with the intention of making a better, a fuller life for themselves, for their families, for us? That's how it feels for Katrina. A year ago today, my life ended at 7:25 a.m. The last time I saw my everything, my Mr. Hendry alive as he walked out our kitchen door in Dorney on his last journey to work at Maui Fish Farm at Ardentoul. Or does it begin when we get the harrowing call to say our loved one has been in an accident? When the police appear at our door in scenes we thought we'd only ever see on TV? When we ourselves set off for the hospital, not knowing what condition we're going to find our loved one in when we get there? Or when the organ donor nurse calls to tell us that they're now at peace? When we're escorted from the cold place where they lay? Or when our stricken loved one is finally retrieved from the place where their life ebbed away? The ending of our loved one's life, it begins our own lifelong journey. And it is all so fundamentally wrong. Because by the time we all go to bed tonight, this will have been the day that at least another 140 families here in the UK set off on this fateful journey, caused by death due to a work-related incident or caused by work-related illness. Same again tomorrow, the next day, the day after that, and so on, unless significant enough change is brought about. So have we been looking at this all wrong? Does our journey in fact begin when our loved one's employer decides that the health and safety of its workforce just isn't an important enough priority? Does it begin when decisions are taken, or indeed are not taken, and as a result, our partner or parent, sibling or child, friend or family member is then exposed to the hazardous substances, processes, or work environment which results in their death? Are we in fact on this journey because government decided that hard-won legislative protections should be stripped back, and that calls for legislative improvement should be knocked back? Do we travel this road because our enforcement authorities have had their abilities to carry out proactive preventative inspections stifled, their governance and their resources having been rifled? And do we have our progress heartbreakingly hampered by the inability of our justice system to deliver answers quickly enough or thoroughly enough? Indeed, often deliver anything even approaching what might be considered justice at all. Because justice would mean organisations and individuals being held properly to account, charged with offences which fit the crime. It would mean punishment which serves as a deterrent to others. And it would mean ensuring that lessons are learned swiftly so that future deaths are prevented. So that when a young man calls his mum to tell her, "I'm drowning in dreams, mother dear," that he actually gets to live out those dreams with his partner, rather than them both lose their lives the very next day when an entirely preventable fire ravages the hotel in which they are staying. His dear mother is still fighting for answers and justice for her boys more than 3 years on. All of this is so very fundamentally wrong. The mum of Tom, who lost his life when he was only 21 years old, wrote recently, "Every day I cry for you and what you lost. I have a painful yearning and ache in my chest constantly to see you, to hug you, to hear you, to talk to you. And there is nothing I can do about it." The ILO has it within their power to do something about this by recognising that our loved ones should have had a fundamental right to be kept safe and to return to us at least as healthy as they were when they left home. We FACers will continue whatever ways we can to seek to make right the current wrongs. We commit to continue working tirelessly to ensure that in future families, they don't have to embark on this FACing journey, one which proved life-ending for our loved ones and will be lifelong for us. We FACers remember all of the dead and will continue to fight like hell for the living.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was a really powerful and moving contribution. I think it really helps to remind us that the tragedy that so many families are faced with in terms of picking up the pieces when things go wrong at work. And, you know, we will all work with you as we go forward on this really, really important issue. I'm now going to move to our final speaker, and that is Gary Smith, who is Scottish Regional Secretary of the GMB and also a member of the STUC General Council. Gary and his union have been a very active voice over the past year in raising workers' concerns over health and safety, be that from care workers to cleansing workers and from the whisky industry to heavy manufacturing. Gary is also the Treasurer of Scottish Action on Asbestos. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you very much, Ros. I'm down on Glasgow Green with a number of comrades from other trade unions, Unite Community, Unison, Glasgow Trades Council and the NUJ. A few of us have come together to socially distance and lay wreaths today. As Chair of Action on Asbestos, I do want to say a huge thank you to the staff at Action on Asbestos who've continued to support families in their hour in need as we've gone through this pandemic. This awful disease associated with asbestos wasn't on hold during the pandemic, and our staff have worked tirelessly to support people desperately in need. I want to echo Pauline's comments about the work that the STUC has been doing this year under your leadership, Ros, because I think the STUC really did come together over the past year as a force for good to press the issues around health and safety and to fight for workers' rights and safe systems of work as we've gone through the pandemic. It was the STUC at its very best. But let me contrast the work of us as the Scottish trade union movement with some of the employers like British Gas, who during the pandemic, whilst their workers were on the front line providing food to the most needy, keeping people warm and safe, that employer was plotting to sack their workforce. And this whole fire and rehire agenda has really come to the fore at a time when so many workers have given so much to keep our society safe and well. And I say this, you know, we today remember comrades, sisters, brothers and friends who we've lost. And it's tragic. Each life lost is an absolute tragedy. But for us though, as trade unions, this would have been so much worse. And I want to pay tribute to the fantastic health and safety reps of our union, indeed, and all the trade unions across Scotland who've been fighting for key workers in refuse and streets and parks and gardens, and of course in care. Those care workers who bravely stood up and spoke out about the conditions that they were having to endure, they deserve such enormous credit for their solidarity and for their courage. And it is an outrage that employers and the Scottish Government failed to provide them with the PPE they so desperately needed at the start of the pandemic. And we will never forget that the home carers in Glasgow had to threaten strike action and start a process of a strike ballot before the employers put in place a system of testing. So today we come together, we grieve, we remember, but we recommit to fight, to organise and to campaign, because we know that together as trade unionists, we really do make a difference. Solidarity, everyone.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you also for the outdoor broadcast that you've brought to us and allowing us to see the beautiful memorial there at Glasgow Green with the wreaths laid. And we know that this will be happening across Scotland, the UK and the rest of the world today as workers come together and remember lost colleagues and recommit themselves to that fight. So colleagues and comrades, that brings us to the end of this year's broadcast event. I'd like to thank you all for attending and for recommitting to this struggle to make workplaces safer and to avoid the needless death and injury that is a daily occurrence at work. And thanks to all those trades councils across Scotland who I know will be holding small events just like there at Glasgow and placing their wreaths at a variety of memorials to mark today. And we send our particular thoughts and good wishes and love to all those who are grieving for loved ones. And I would like to repeat what many of our speakers have said today, which is that today we remember the dead, but each and every day we recommit to fighting like hell for the living. Our commitment to that remains and will always be to organise to make the human right of health and safety a reality. Thank you.